They laughed in her face, right in the notary's office, in front of the lawyer, in front of her whole family. They laughed out loud when she received a dilapidated house and a stack of old papers. The man she had loved, cared for 40 years, seemed to have abandoned her with something nobody wanted. But Harold Whitmore never did anything without a reason. And she, Evelyn Carter, was about to realize that their laughter that day was the most expensive mistake they had ever made. Please like, comment the city you're watching so I know how far my story has progressed. And follow to the end, because the ending will keep you glued to the screen. I was 63 years old the morning I became a widow, and I did not cry the way people expected me to. I had spent 2 days before Harold's funeral making sure the flowers were right, white lilies because he hated roses, and had told me so on our second date, back when we were young and nobody had any money and everything felt possible. I had made sure his dark suit was pressed. I had sat through 3 hours of his business associates shaking my hand and telling me what a visionary he was, what a force of nature, what an irreplaceable pillar of the community. And I had nodded and thanked them because Harold would have wanted me to handle it with dignity. What Harold would not have wanted was what came next. The reading of the will was scheduled for the Thursday following the burial. I drove myself to the law offices of Hargrove and Pell because I did not want to ride with Derek, and I had learned over the better part of a decade that sharing enclosed spaces with my stepson had a way of making the air feel thinner. I parked in the garage across the street, sat in my car for 4 minutes longer than I needed to, and told myself to breathe. The conference room on the 14th floor had a long mahogany table that reflected the ceiling lights and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. Harold had liked this room. He used to say it was the kind of room that made you remember what you were working toward. I had been in it twice before. Once when we updated our estate documents 3 years ago, and once when Harold signed the papers that finalized the sale of Whitmore Industries' Eastern Division. Derek was already there when I arrived. He was standing near the windows with his back to the door, talking on his phone with the low, clipped certainty he used when he wanted everyone in the room to know he was important. His wife, Sandra, sat in one of the leather chairs with her legs crossed, scrolling something on her phone without looking up. Their son, Brendan, 24, restless, wearing a jacket that cost more than most people's rent, was leaning against the wall eating a granola bar like he was waiting for a bus. Derek's sister, Pauline, sat at the far end of the table with her husband, a quiet man named Glenn, and she looked the way she always looked at family events, like she was already counting the minutes until she could leave. I sat down across from Pauline. She gave me a small, careful smile. We had never been close. Harold's first wife had poisoned that well before she died, but Pauline had always been civil, which was more than I could say for her brother. Derek ended his call, turned around, and saw me. Evelyn. The way he said my name had always carried a faint edge, like a knife kept just barely sheathed. Didn't think you'd be this early. I'm exactly on time, I said. He glanced at his watch and said nothing. He pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down in it. That was the chair Harold used to sit in. I noticed it. I did not say anything. Martin Hargrove came in at 5 minutes past 10. Harold had always said that Martin was the only lawyer he'd ever met who was genuinely punctual, which meant he was usually 5 minutes late, but never more. And he was carrying a leather folio and a sealed envelope that was thick enough to make Sandra look up from her phone. Thank you all for coming, Martin said, setting his things down at the end of the table opposite Derek. I know this has been a difficult week for the family, and I want to get through this as clearly and efficiently as possible. Harold was very specific about his wishes, and I intend to honor that. That's what we're paying you for, Derek said. Martin looked at him without expression. Harold was paying me. Now his estate is paying me. If we could begin. I watched Derek's jaw tighten and felt something small and mean in myself take a quiet, guilty satisfaction in it. Martin opened the folio. He adjusted his glasses. He began to speak. The early sections of Harold's will were straightforward: charitable bequests, disbursements to long-term employees at Whitmore Industries, a scholarship fund at the university where Harold had studied engineering 40 years ago. 20,000 here, 50,000 there. Derek sat through all of it with the impatient stillness of someone waiting for the main event. Then Martin got to the company. Whitmore Industries, including all associated subsidiaries, trademarks, and operating assets, is to be transferred in full to Derek Harold Whitmore, effective upon the completion of probate. The room changed. Derek didn't smile, not yet, but his posture shifted in that very specific way, the way of a man who has just confirmed something he already believed. Sandra reached over and touched his arm. Brendan pushed off the wall. Pauline received the investment portfolios and the primary residence in Ashford Heights, which was more than fair. It was the house she'd grown up in, and Harold had told me privately that he'd always intended it to go back to her. She nodded when Martin read it aloud and pressed her fingers to her lips for a moment. Glenn put his hand over hers. Then Martin paused. He picked up a separate document from beneath the folio. The remaining assets designated for Evelyn Patricia Carter Whitmore, he said, are as follows. Derek leaned back in his chair. He was already wearing the expression of a man who had won. The Carver Road property, formerly known as the Callaway Farmstead, located at Rural Route 4, approximately 14 miles north of the county line, including all structures and outbuildings thereon. He paused again. And a collection of personal documents and records currently stored in a locked cabinet on the aforementioned property, the contents of which are described in a separate memorandum. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then Derek laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite, restrained chuckle, but an actual laugh, the kind that comes from genuine surprise and genuine contempt in equal measure. He looked at Sandra, and Sandra looked at him, and she started laughing too, with one hand over her mouth like she was trying to be decent about it, which she was not. A farmhouse, Derek said. He left you a farmhouse. And documents, Brendan offered, smirking. Documents. Derek shook his head. Evelyn, I don't know whether to feel sorry for you or, well, no, I think I do know. I looked at him. I kept my hands flat on the table. Harold loved you in his way, Derek said, in the tone of a man offering a consolation prize. But let's be honest about what this is. He left me the company he spent 30 years building. He left Pauline the family home. And he left you. He gestured broadly with one hand, the gesture of a man encompassing something ridiculous, a pile of old wood and some paperwork. I think that tells you everything you need to know about where you stood. Derek? Pauline's voice was quiet but sharp. What? I'm being honest. It's kinder than letting her sit here thinking there's some mystery to unravel. That's enough, Martin said. Derek smiled. Is it? I did not respond. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I was watching Martin's face, and Martin's face was doing something interesting. He was not embarrassed. He was not sympathetic in the apologetic, pitying way I might have expected. He was patient in the way of a man who knows something that the rest of the room doesn't. I filed that away. Martin completed the reading. He answered a few procedural questions from Derek's side, about transfer timelines, about the company's existing debt structure, about the valuation, and I sat and listened and didn't ask anything. When it was over, Derek was still flushed with satisfaction. He shook Martin's hand with the expansive warmth of a man who has just gotten what he wanted. On his way out, he stopped beside my chair. If you want, I can have someone look at the farmhouse, he said. Get it condemned or sold for you. Save you the trouble of dealing with it. I appreciate that, I said. Good. I'll have Sandra reach out. He walked out. Sandra followed. Brendan finished his granola bar and tossed the wrapper in the general direction of the trash can and missed, and then they were gone. Pauline came around the table and sat in the chair next to me. I'm sorry, she said. He's Derek, I said. That's not an excuse. No, I agreed. It's not. She squeezed my hand once and then stood up, and she and Glenn gathered their things and left quietly. When they were gone, it was just me and Martin and the hum of the building's ventilation system. Martin was repacking his folio. He moved slowly, with deliberate care, like a man doing a task he wanted to do correctly. Martin, I said. Yes. He knew what he was doing. Martin looked up. Harold? Yes. He did. The farmhouse, the documents. He planned this. Martin set the folio down and folded his hands on the table. He was a measured man, a careful man, the kind of man who had been practicing law for 30 years and knew exactly when to speak and when to let silence do the work. Evelyn, he said. Harold asked me specifically not to characterize his intentions at the reading. What I can tell you is that his instructions regarding your portion of the estate were unusually detailed, more detailed than most, and that he asked me to give you this He reached into the folio and produced a small envelope, cream-colored, with my name written on it in Harold's handwriting, privately, after everyone else had left. I took the envelope. My name, in Harold's careful, angular script, the handwriting of an engineer, all precision, nothing wasted. He also asked me to tell you, Martin continued, that the memorandum regarding the documents at the property should be read before you go to the house. Not after. Before. He paused. He was particular about that. I opened the envelope at the table, in the empty conference room, with Martin waiting quietly at the other end. The letter was 2 pages, front and back, and it was unmistakably Harold, the way he wrote the same way he talked, with no sentiment wasted but no necessary thing omitted. He had written it 3 months before his death, which meant he'd known what was coming and hadn't told me, and that was something I would have to sit with later, when there was time. He wrote, Evelyn, I did not leave you the company because you do not need it and it would burden you. I did not leave you the house because it belongs to Pauline in a way I can't fully explain, and you have always understood that. What I am leaving you is the thing I found 31 years ago and spent the rest of my life protecting because I wanted to give it to someone I trusted with the whole of myself. You are the only person I have ever trusted that completely. Go to the farmhouse. Start with the cabinet in the back room. The combination is the date of our first real argument. You'll remember it. I'm sorry I can't be there. I'm not sorry about any of the rest. H. I read it twice. Then I folded it and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in my purse. Thank you, Martin, I said. Of course. I drove home the long way through the old part of the city where Harold and I had lived when we were first married. Before the money, before the business grew into something that required staff and drivers and a house with a name. I drove past the apartment building on Clement Street where we'd had a third-floor walk-up with a broken radiator and a view of the parking structure across the alley, and I sat in the car for a few minutes outside it, and then I drove on. I had met Harold at a real estate closing 16 years ago. I was a paralegal at a firm that handled commercial property transactions, and he was the buyer on a mid-size office building deal that had dragged on for 4 months. Due to a zoning dispute I had spent most of those 4 months trying to untangle. He was 51 and twice widowed and impatient in the way of a man who had learned that time was the one resource that didn't replenish itself. I was 47 and twice divorced and had grown comfortable with the assumption that the complicated chapter of my life involving other people's hearts was probably behind me. The closing took 3 hours. Afterward, he asked if I wanted coffee, and I said yes because I was tired and needed it, not because I expected anything. We talked for an hour and a half in a diner around the corner from the title company and discovered that we both thought the same city councilman was an idiot and that we both ordered our coffee the same way, which Harold said was either meaningless or significant, and he wasn't sure which. I said probably meaningless. He said probably not. We were married 2 years later. Small ceremony, immediate family, dinner at a restaurant afterward. His children, Derek, 29, and Pauline, 26, attended. Pauline was gracious. Derek shook my hand without smiling and spent most of the dinner in conversation with the business associate he'd brought as his +1, a young man named Garrett, who would later become his chief operating officer, and later still, a persistent source of financial problems. I had never pretended that Harold's money meant nothing to me, because it did mean something, practically. It allowed me to stop working 70-hour weeks and to actually inhabit my own life, which I had been neglecting. But I had also never wanted it for itself. I had wanted Harold, the actual complicated person, who was infuriating about minor things and extraordinary about major ones, who forgot to eat when he was focused on a problem, who had grown up poor and never entirely trusted comfort, who could be cold in the way of people who have taught themselves not to need things and then discovered, too late, that they do. Derek had decided early that I was after the money. He had decided it so thoroughly and so permanently that no evidence to the contrary was going to change it. I had understood that about him within 6 months of the marriage, and I had made a quiet peace with the fact that we were never going to be what either of us would have wanted under better circumstances. But I had not understood, until that Thursday in Martin Hargrove's conference room, how much he had underestimated me. Passwords. I waited 4 days before I went to the farmhouse. I needed the time. I needed to sit with Harold's letter and the memorandum Martin had provided, a 2-page legal document describing in careful procedural language, the contents of the cabinet, property maps, survey records, contractual agreements, and what was described only as correspondence of material relevance. I needed to let the grief that I had been holding at a managed distance come a little closer, because it was going to come regardless. And it was better to let it move through me in the house I knew than to have it catch me off guard somewhere unfamiliar. I cried the night Harold had been gone 1 week. I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, and the city quiet outside. And I missed him with the specific physical weight of long-term love, which is different from early love in that it has so much more mass. All those years accumulated, all those ordinary mornings, all the specific and irreplaceable knowledge of another person's habits and preferences and fears. I missed the sound of him moving around in the kitchen at 6 in the morning because he always woke up before me and couldn't stay in bed. I missed the way he read, with one finger tracking the line and his lips moving slightly on difficult passages that he would never admit were difficult. I missed arguing with him about things that didn't matter. Then I slept. And in the morning, I made coffee and ate toast standing up and found the farmhouse's address in the memorandum and put it in my phone. Rural Route 4 was 40 minutes from the city, through country that gradually shifted from suburb to exurb to actual farmland, field and tree line, and the occasional cluster of outbuildings that told you someone worked this land, or used to. The address resolved to a gravel lane off the county road, marked by a mailbox that had been bent at a 30-degree angle by some vehicle at some point in the past and never straightened. The lane ran about a quarter-mile back through overgrown grass and spindly second-growth trees before arriving at the farmhouse. It was not entirely what I'd expected. I had pictured something falling apart, boards missing, roof caved, the kind of ruin you'd pass on a country drive and feel vaguely sad about. The Callaway farmhouse was neglected, but not destroyed. The white paint had gone gray and was peeling in long vertical strips. 2 of the porch boards were rotted through. A section of gutter had come loose on the east side and was hanging at an angle, but the bones of it were intact. Wide front porch, 2 stories, dormers in the roofline, a stone chimney on the north end that looked solid. Behind it, maybe 30 feet back, a large barn with red paint faded to rust pink, doors chained shut. I sat in the car for a minute. I thought about Harold, 31 years ago, finding this place. I thought about what he might have seen in it that no one else could see. I took the key Martin had given me and went inside. The interior smelled like old paper and dry wood and something faintly mineral, like the smell of a stone wall after rain. The floors were wide plank pine, dusty, but solid underfoot. The furniture that remained, a table, a few chairs, a settee in the front room, was draped in canvas covers that had accumulated dust of their own. There were no pictures on the walls. The kitchen had an old gas range that wouldn't be functional, and a farmhouse sink with a crack in the basin. The back room, behind the kitchen, was what had once been a mudroom or a utility space, and it held, against the far wall, a fireproof filing cabinet, battleship gray, 2 drawers with a combination lock on the upper drawer. I stood in front of it for a moment. The combination is the date of our first real argument. We'd had plenty of small arguments, but our first real one, the one with weight, the one that had lasted 2 days and almost derailed everything, had happened 11 months after we met, before we were even engaged. It was about Harold's older son. It was about a loan Derek had asked Harold for, and Harold had given without telling me, even though we had been talking about pooling our finances and building something together. And I thought we were past the point of significant financial decisions made unilaterally. I had not been angry about the money. I'd been angry about being overlooked, which was different and worse. September 14th. I was sure of it. I dialed 914 on the lock, hesitated, then added the year. 9/14/07. The lock opened. Inside the upper drawer, 4 manila folders bound together with a rubber band that had dried out and broke when I touched it, and beneath them a smaller envelope with my name on it in the same angular hand. I read the letter first. The folders have an order. Start with the one marked Survey, Callaway North. Read it carefully. The survey map is the key to understanding what the others say. I'll explain the rest in the letter that comes with the last folder. I had a lawyer I trusted, not Martin, someone else, prepare these over about 6 years because I wanted to be certain before I acted on any of it. I was certain by 2019. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I wanted to give it to you clean, without the anxiety of it hanging over both of us. You will understand when you read everything. You were always the one who understood what I was actually doing when I was quiet. H. I sat down on the floor of that dusty back room, with the filing cabinet open beside me and Harold's handwriting in front of me, and I started reading. The survey map was old. The header dated it to 1987, amended 1994, and it covered an area that included the Callaway farmstead and extended significantly north and west, past a creek and through what was designated as scrubland. The annotations were dense and technical, and I was not a surveyor, but I had spent enough years in real estate law to read a property map, and what I was reading did not look like the map of a neglected piece of agricultural land. The second folder contained documents that appeared to be private agreements, not recorded with any county office, not publicly accessible, structured specifically as private contracts between Harold's holding company and a limited liability company called Meridian Land Partners, LLC, dated 2009. The agreements referenced subsurface mineral rights and development corridor access in language that was careful and specific and obviously written by someone who knew exactly what they were protecting. I read the agreements twice. Then I set them aside and opened the third folder. The third folder contained geological survey results. A private firm, engaged in 2008, had conducted subsurface analysis of the Callaway North parcel and the adjacent land. The report was dense with technical language I didn't fully understand, but I understood numbers, and the numbers in this report were not small. They referenced mineral deposits. They referenced the area's relationship to a proposed development corridor that, as of the report's date, was in early planning stages with the county. I sat with that for a long time. Outside, through the dirty windows of the back room, the afternoon light was moving through the overgrown grass in the way that light does in late autumn, low and golden and without warmth. Harold had known. He had known for 17 years, at minimum, and possibly longer. He had known that the land beneath this neglected farmhouse was not neglected at all, that it was holding something patiently, the way Harold himself held things, quietly and without advertisement, until the moment was right. I opened the fourth folder. The fourth folder was the one Harold had called the key to understanding the others. It was a summary document prepared by Harold himself, not by lawyers in his own handwriting, 4 pages dense with his small, precise script, and it laid out, in the plainest terms he could manage, the full picture. In 1987, Harold had been approached by a man named Callaway, the original owner of this property, who was in financial difficulty and looking for a quiet buyer. Harold had already made enough money to be an interesting conversation partner. He'd bought the farmhouse and the surrounding land for what was, even then, a below-market price, because Callaway needed liquidity and Harold needed privacy. What Callaway didn't know, what Harold had discovered through his own research before the purchase, was that the land sat on something. Not oil, not natural gas, but a mineral deposit of a specific rare earth type that was, in 1987, commercially uninteresting and therefore unregulated and uncontested. Harold had kept this to himself. He had paid for the geological survey in 2008 when rare earth minerals began to attract serious commercial attention, and the results had confirmed what he'd suspected for 20 years. But the minerals were only part of it. The development corridor, a major infrastructure project that had been in regional planning for a decade and a half before Harold's death, involving a highway expansion and a commercial zone designation along the northern county route, ran directly through the access land adjacent to the Callaway property. Harold's private agreements with Meridian Land Partners gave his holding company, and therefore his estate, access rights and development partnership stakes that were, as of the most recent agreements, worth a number that I had to read twice. It was not a small number. It was not a number that fit in the same sentence as neglected farmhouse. Harold's handwriting continued onto the final page. I want to be clear about why I structured this the way I did. Derek is not a bad person, but he is a person who responds to power by using it, and if he had known this existed, he would have found a way to take it, and he would have found a way to take it from you. I could not let that happen. I am giving you the company's public face, which is what he wants, and what he's built his identity around. I am giving you the real thing, because you are the only person I trust to do something worthy with it. Don't let anyone pressure you. You have time. Read everything. Then call Martin. Bish. I drove back to the city in the dark. I didn't call Martin that night. I needed one more day to sit with what I'd found, to let it settle from overwhelming into manageable, to understand that what Harold had done was not leave me behind. It was the opposite of leaving me behind. That night, I sat at the kitchen table again, in the same spot where I'd cried the week before, and I read the folders again from start to finish. I thought about Derek's laugh in that conference room, the full, unguarded contempt of it, the way he'd looked at me, at 63, a widow, and seen only the inventory of what I lacked. He had been so sure. He had been so completely, unreservedly sure that he had won, that the winning was obvious, that the outcome was exactly what it appeared to be, and required no further investigation. I thought about Harold writing those documents in his careful handwriting. I thought about 31 years of patience, of holding something quietly while the world moved around it, not because he was passive. Harold was never passive, but because he understood something that Derek had never managed to learn. The timing was not his to choose. The moment would come, or it wouldn't, and when it came, you needed to have done the work. I closed the last folder. Outside, the city hummed its low, constant hum, indifferent as cities always are to the small, private turnings of individual lives. I went to bed. I slept, actually slept, for the first time in 2 weeks. And in the morning, I called Martin. Martin picked up on the second ring. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said, and there was something in his voice, not surprise, not pity, but a kind of careful readiness, the way a person sounds when they've been waiting for something they knew was coming. "I read everything," I said. And I need to understand what I'm actually holding before I do anything else. That's the right instinct." He paused. "Can you come in tomorrow?" "Not the main office. I have a smaller space I use for private matters. I'll text you the address." I said yes and hung up, and then I sat with my coffee going cold and thought about Harold, who had spent 17 years arranging something this complicated and had never once let it show on his face. Not at dinner, not in bed on a Sunday morning, not even at the end, when he must have known his time was short and there was still so much he hadn't said out loud. That was the thing about loving Harold Whitmore. You were always, on some level, discovering how much you hadn't known. Bapti. The smaller office was in a building 12 blocks from the main firm, the kind of address that doesn't appear on professional letterhead. A suite on the 3rd floor above a dry cleaner, accessible through a side entrance and a stairwell that smelled like steam and cleaning solvent. I had to admire Harold's methodology. He had kept this particular set of affairs entirely separate from the infrastructure of his public life, which meant it had never been visible to Derek, who had spent years watching Harold's primary business like a hawk watching a field. Martin was waiting for me with 2 legal pads, a thermos of coffee, and a man I didn't recognize, early 50s, compact, with the unremarkable appearance of someone who had spent a career deliberately not being memorable. "This is Ray Delacroix," Martin said. "He's the attorney Harold engaged separately for the Callaway matter. He prepared the private agreements and managed the relationship with Meridian Land Partners over the past several years." Ray Delacroix shook my hand with a firmness that was professional rather than warm. "Mrs. Whitmore, Harold spoke of you often." "Call me Evelyn," I said. "And whatever he told you, some of it is probably flattering and some of it is probably accurate." Something shifted in Ray's expression. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "He said you were direct. That was one of the accurate ones." We sat down. Martin poured coffee. And for the next 2.5 hours, I received the education that Harold had left me. The picture that emerged over those hours was this. Harold had not simply preserved a piece of valuable land. He had spent 16 years building a legal architecture around it. Quiet, patient, airtight, designed specifically to withstand the kind of challenge that a person like Derek would mount the moment he understood what was at stake. The private agreements with Meridian Land Partners were structured through Harold's holding company, which was a separate legal entity from Whitmore Industries entirely. Derek's inheritance of the company gave him no access to the holding company's assets. None. Harold had made certain of that with a precision that, Ray told me, had required 3 rounds of legal review to fully secure. He anticipated a challenge, Ray said, setting a document in front of me. He told me explicitly that his son would contest this once he understood it. He wanted the structure to be unambiguous enough that a contest would fail. How confident are you that it would fail? I asked. Ray glanced at Martin, then back at me. In my professional opinion, very confident. The agreements are recorded, the mineral rights are properly documented, and Harold's holding company was never commingled with Whitmore Industries at any point. There is no legal basis for Derek to claim an interest in any of this. I looked at the document in front of me, the recorded deed for the Callaway North parcel, with Harold's holding company named as owner, and below that in the chain of title, my name as the estate's sole beneficiary. What does this actually mean? I asked. In plain terms, what am I holding? Martin took that one. The mineral rights, based on current market assessments for that deposit type, are valued in the range of $8 to $12 million. That's a conservative estimate and could move significantly depending on commercial demand, which has been trending upward. He paused. The development corridor access rights are a separate matter. The infrastructure project that Harold's agreements anticipated has now been formally approved by the county. Meridian Land Partners is prepared to proceed with the development partnership. Based on the terms of Harold's agreements, your estate holds a 22% stake in the primary corridor development. He slid another page across to me. I looked at the figure at the bottom. My first thought was that it was a typographical error. My second thought was that Harold had always said that patience was the only investment strategy that never went out of fashion. I started. Yes, Martin said simply. I set the paper down. I looked at the window, which faced a brick wall across the alley. I thought about Derek's laugh, the easy, contemptuous certainty of it, a farmhouse, the way he'd said it, as if the category of thing told you everything you needed to know. He had no idea, I said. None, Ray confirmed. Harold was meticulous about keeping these two worlds entirely separate. Derek knew about the farmhouse only in the vaguest sense. Harold mentioned it once, years ago, as an old property he'd held for sentimental reasons. He had no reason to look further. Sentimental reasons. Harold had used the phrase deliberately, I was certain. He had known exactly how to make something invisible to a person who only looked for what he expected to see. I did not call a celebration. I drove home, made a simple dinner I ate standing at the kitchen counter, and then sat with the legal pad I'd taken notes on and thought, carefully, about what came next. Here is what I knew about myself. At 63, in the weeks after my husband's death, I was not a vindictive person by nature. I had felt vindictive at moments. At that conference room table, listening to Derek's laugh, I had felt something cold and hard move through me that I recognized as the desire to see him diminished. But vindictiveness as a sustaining state had never suited me. It required too much energy that could go elsewhere, and it kept you facing backward. What I actually wanted, when I sat quietly with it, was to understand Harold's full vision and then figure out what I thought was right to do with it. Harold's summary had said, "Don't let anyone pressure you. You have time." I intended to take that seriously. Yes. The pressure arrived 11 days later, in the form of Derek at my front door at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning, without warning, without having called, wearing the expression of a man who has recently received information that has not improved his mood. I opened the door and looked at him. "Derek? We need to talk. You could have called." "I did. You didn't pick up." That was true. I had seen his name on my phone and let it go to voicemail, which I had not yet listened to. "Come in," I said, because there was no productive alternative, and because Harold had raised this man from childhood, and I owed it to Harold's memory to try one more time. Derek sat in the armchair in the living room, Harold's armchair, which irritated me more than it should have, and I sat on the sofa across from him with my hands in my lap and waited. "I've been looking at the company's books," he said. "All right. There's a land holding, a holding company separate from Whitmore Industries that Dad apparently maintained for years without—" He stopped, recalibrated, "without discussing it with anyone." I kept my face still. "Is that so?" "The holding company has assets, significant assets, assets that I think were always intended to be part of the family estate and that should have been distributed as part of the primary estate, not—" Derek. My voice was quiet. The will was read 3 weeks ago. Martin Hargrove read every provision. Everything was properly documented and legally structured. If you have questions about the estate, you should direct them to Martin. I have directed them to Martin. Martin told me the holding company's assets were specifically excluded from the company transfer. Then Martin answered your question. Derek looked at me the way he'd been looking at me for 16 years, which was the look of a man who believed I had always been in his way and had simply never been honest enough to admit it. There was something almost satisfying about it now, in a way I hadn't expected, not because of what I knew, but because of how clearly I could see the machinery of his thinking. You knew, he said. You knew what was in those documents before the reading. I did not. Harold gave me a letter after the reading. I found the documents at the farmhouse afterward. How convenient. Derek. I was tired, suddenly, in the deep way of someone who has been having a version of this conversation for 16 years. Your father structured his estate the way he chose to structure it. He was not confused. He was not manipulated. He was a man who spent 30 years making careful decisions, and he made this one carefully too. If you are angry at someone, be angry at him. But he's not here. Something moved across his face. I had expected anger. What came instead was something more unsettled, and I realized, not for the first time but more clearly than before, that underneath all of Derek's certainty was a man who had never fully accepted that his father had made decisions that didn't center on him. He built that company from nothing, Derek said. I gave 15 years to it. 15 years. I know. And he left the real money. He left you the company. That is not nothing. It is if the company is... He stopped again. Something changed in the room. If the company is what? I asked. Derek looked away. He looked at the window. He looked at his hands. He was wearing his father's watch. I noticed it, the same way I'd noticed him taking the head of the table at the reading, and I filed it away the way I'd been filing things away for 16 years. The company has some debt, he said. Some exposure that I'm working through. How much exposure? He didn't answer right away. It's manageable. I have a plan. I looked at him. He was 52 years old, and he was sitting in his dead father's chair telling me that the thing he'd inherited, the thing he'd laughed about winning, had problems he was already calling manageable, which was the word people used when they meant they weren't sure. Derek, I said as gently as I could manage, which was not very gently but was honest. I'm not your enemy. I never was. But I am not able to help you with the company. That's yours. That was always what you wanted, and now it's yours. And what happens next with it is your responsibility. He stood up. He buttoned his jacket, the way Harold used to button his jacket when a meeting was over and he was ready to move on. The gesture was so precise a copy that it stopped my breath for a moment. I'm going to talk to a lawyer, he said, about the holding company. That is absolutely your right, I said. Talk to as many lawyers as you like. He left. I stood at the window and watched his car pull away from the curb, and then I went to the kitchen and stood at the sink and ran cold water over my wrists, which was a thing I did when I needed to feel steady. Then I called Ray Delacroix. He's going to challenge it, I said. I know, Ray said. We're ready. I've been ready for this since 2019. Evelyn, I want you to hear this clearly. There is no legitimate legal pathway for him to reach those assets. Harold made sure. But Derek is going to have to discover that for himself, and it's going to take some time, and it is going to be unpleasant. I know. Are you all right? I thought about that for a moment, not as a formality, but actually. Was I all right? I am, I said. I'm angry, but I'm all right. What came over the following 3 weeks was unpleasant in the specific grinding way of legal maneuvering. Not dramatic, not sudden, but persistent, like weather. Derek had engaged a firm that specialized in estate disputes, and they sent 2 letters in quick succession, each one framing a slightly different theory of why Harold's holding company assets should be considered part of the company transfer. Ray responded to both, concisely, citing the specific provisions Harold had spent years ensuring were bulletproof. The letters stopped. Then Sandra called me. I almost didn't pick up, but there was a part of me, the same part that had made me invite Derek inside when he'd shown up unannounced, that believed in at least attempting civility. Evelyn, Sandra said, in the particular tone she used when she was doing a version of warmth that didn't quite come from anywhere real. I hope I'm not interrupting. You are, I said. But go ahead. A small pause. Derek is under a lot of pressure right now. The transition at the company it's been complex, and I think some of what he said when he came to see you came out wrong. What part? I asked. He doesn't mean to be. He's not trying to take anything from you. He just needs to understand the full picture. Sandra. I kept my voice even. Derek has 2 attorneys and access to all the publicly recorded documents. He has everything he needs to understand the full picture. What he doesn't have is access to assets that Harold specifically, deliberately, legally structured to go elsewhere. If the 2 of you are hoping I'm going to negotiate that, I want to be clear. I'm not. Silence on the line, then, "You've changed, Evelyn." "Yes," I said. "I suppose I have." Harold would want the family. Don't, I said. Don't tell me what Harold would want. I have 87 pages of his handwriting telling me exactly what Harold wanted, and not one sentence of it says to give Derek what he's asking for. Sandra hung up. I stood in my kitchen with the phone in my hand, and I noticed that my hands were perfectly steady. No cold water required. Gesamt. It was Pauline who reached out next, and Pauline was different. She called one evening and said only, "Can I come over? Not to talk about any of this, just, can I come over?" She sat at my kitchen table and drank tea, and for a while we didn't talk about Derek or the estate or any of it. We talked about Harold, specific memories, the kind that surface in the weeks after someone dies, small and precise and irreplaceable. She told me about the summer she was 14 and Harold had driven 6 hours to get to a school recital she'd been in, arriving 12 minutes before it ended, having missed a board meeting to make it. She'd been angry that he was late. He'd never told her about the meeting. She'd found out from his secretary 10 years later. "That was him," I said. "Exactly." "I know." She wrapped both hands around her mug. He's in trouble, Evelyn, the company. It's worse than what he's saying." I waited. "He made some decisions the last 2 years that Dad didn't know about. Or maybe Dad knew and couldn't stop it. Some investment agreements with Garrett. You remember Garrett, Derek's?" "I remember Garrett," I said. "They went badly." Significant exposure. Derek was counting on the company being, she paused, chosen her words, being more liquid than it is. He was counting on having more options than he has. I thought about Derek in the armchair saying, "It's manageable," and looking at his hands. "I'm not going to be able to help him," I said. I wasn't being cold. I was being accurate. "Even if I wanted to, Pauline, these assets aren't mine to give away. They're connected to agreements that involve other parties. It's not a simple thing to just hand over." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to. She stopped. "I just wanted you to know, because I think Derek is going to make things ugly before he accepts it, and I think you should be prepared." "I am," I said. She finished her tea and said goodnight, and I walked her to the door, and we stood for a moment on the porch in the cold air, neither of us entirely comfortable and neither of us willing to leave it there. "He's still my brother," she said. "Even when he is," I agreed. "And you don't have to choose. I'm not asking you to choose." She nodded. She left. And I went inside and stood in Harold's kitchen, in Harold's house, which was my house now. And I let myself feel for just a moment the full weight of being 63 and a widow, and at the center of a war I had not started. Then I made myself dinner. And I sat at the table with Harold's letter and a legal pad, and I began to write down what I thought I actually wanted to do with everything he'd left me. Not what I was entitled to. Not what was expedient. What I actually wanted, if I had the freedom to want it cleanly, without fear. I wrote for 2 hours. What came out surprised me. Not in its specifics, but in how clearly I already knew, somewhere below where the conflict and the grief had been sitting, exactly what Harold had seen when he'd imagined this moment. He had not imagined a war. He had imagined an arrival. I was still 3 weeks from understanding the full shape of what was coming, and a month from the meeting that would change everything again. But for that night, I had the letter and the legal pad and the quiet house, and it was enough. The summons arrived by certified mail on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the initial reading of the will. I say summons But that's not what it was called on the envelope. It was called a Notice of Legal Conference, prepared by Martin Hargrove's office, addressed to all parties of the Whitmore estate. The language was formal and procedurally neutral, the way legal language always is when it's covering something that is anything but neutral. It requested my presence, along with Derek and Pauline and their respective legal representatives, at the offices of Hargrove and Pell on the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning. No explanation of purpose. No preview of what would be discussed. Just the date, the time, the address, and Martin's signature at the bottom. I called Martin immediately. "What is this?" I asked. "It's a meeting that Harold requested be convened," he said. "The triggering conditions have been met." "What triggering conditions?" "The conditions Harold specified in a sealed document he filed with this office approximately 2 years before his death. I'm not able to say more than that over the phone. I'm sorry, Evelyn. I know that's frustrating." It was frustrating. It was also, in a specific way I was beginning to recognize as Harold's signature, exactly the kind of move Harold would make, structuring something so that it could only be fully understood at the moment of maximum impact, when all the relevant parties were in the same room. "Was Derek notified?" I asked. All parties were notified simultaneously, same letter, same day. I stood at my kitchen window with the notice in one hand and the phone in the other, and thought about Derek opening his envelope, reading the same sparse language, and trying to figure out what it meant. I thought about whether he would feel what I felt, that electric, slightly dreadful anticipation of something arriving that has been a long time in transit. Probably not exactly, but probably something. Buzz. I did not sleep well the 4 nights before Tuesday. Not from anxiety exactly. It was more that my mind refused to stop working, turning the known pieces over and re-examining them, trying to anticipate what the sealed document might contain that hadn't already been covered in the farmhouse folders. I had thought I understood the full architecture of what Harold had built. The mineral rights, the development corridor stake, the holding company structure. But Harold had said in his letter that the sealed file was separate, and Martin had confirmed it was filed independently of everything I'd already read. There was something else. I kept returning to that. On the Monday night before the meeting, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine I barely touched, and Harold's photograph, the one from our 5th anniversary, both of us slightly sunburned from a week at the coast, Harold looking directly at the camera with the expression he wore when he was genuinely happy, which was different from his professional smile in a way that people who didn't know him well never noticed. And I talked to him, which I had been doing occasionally since his death, not because I expected answers, but because it helped me organize my thoughts. "What else did you build?" I asked the photograph. "What else did you put somewhere I haven't found yet?" The photograph naturally said nothing, but I went to bed feeling steadier, the way I always had after talking through a problem, even with someone who couldn't respond. Tuesday was gray and cold, the kind of November morning that the city wore like a coat it had owned for decades. I arrived at Hargrove and Pell at 9:40 and took the elevator to the 14th floor and stood in the corridor outside the conference room for a moment, breathing. Inside I could hear voices, Derek's lower and clipped. Another voice I didn't recognize. His attorney, presumably. I straightened my jacket, which was Harold's favorite, dark navy, good wool, the kind of thing you buy knowing it will last, and opened the door. The room was fuller than it had been at the first reading. Derek sat where he'd sat before, with a man I didn't know on his left. Mid-40s, expensive suit, the particular expression of an estate litigation attorney who has been paid to look confident. Sandra was there, which she hadn't been invited to be, and which no one had apparently challenged. Brendan was absent. Pauline sat at the far end again with Glenn, and she looked like she had also not been sleeping. Martin stood at the head of the table with a leather folio, and beside him, which was new, a second man I recognized from the smaller office, Ray Delacroix, present now in his official capacity as attorney for the holding company. I sat down. Martin waited until the room settled. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "I'll get directly to the purpose of this meeting." He opened the folio and produced a sealed envelope, cream, thick, Harold's handwriting on the front. Not my name this time, just, "To be opened when conditions are met, H.W." "Harold Whitmore filed this document with my office in January of 2 years ago," Martin said. "The filing instructions specified that it was to remain sealed until 2 conditions were met. The first condition was Harold's death. The The second condition was that a period of no less than 45 days following the initial estate reading had elapsed. Today is day 46. He paused. I want to be clear for the record that I have not read this document. No one in this office has read it. The seal is intact. I am opening it now, in the presence of all parties, as Harold instructed. The room was very quiet. The ventilation system hummed. Derek's attorney made a small note on his legal pad. Martin broke the seal. He took a breath, the small, contained breath of a man centering himself, and began to read. What Harold had written, and it was in his own voice, not in legal language, which Martin read with the careful neutrality of someone honoring the specific texture of another person's words, was this. He had, in 1994, entered into a private agreement with a man named Thomas Aldrin, a regional developer who had approached Harold about a land corridor project in the northern county. The agreement had given Aldrin's company a 30-year easement on a strip of land adjacent to the Callaway property, in exchange for a 22% equity stake in whatever development ultimately materialized from that corridor. The 30-year term, Harold noted, expired in 2024. The development, which had moved slowly through planning for decades, had been formally approved by the county in the spring of the year Harold died. It was now active. The 30-year easement had converted, per the terms of the original agreement, into a permanent development partnership stake. And attached to this letter were the original 1994 agreement, the 2024 conversion documentation, and a current valuation assessment prepared by an independent firm 6 months before Harold's death. Martin set the letter down and picked up the assessment. He read the figure. I will not pretend that I was prepared for it. I had known the numbers from the folders at the farmhouse, and those numbers had been significant enough to require reading twice. This number was larger. It was larger because it incorporated the full activated value of the development stake now that the project had received formal county approval, combined with the mineral rights assessment, combined with a third element I had not previously known existed, a separate parcel of land Harold had quietly acquired in 2018, adjacent to the corridor, which had been added to the holding company's assets and was now included in the valuation. The total figure was not, by any reasonable measure, what anyone in that room had been expecting, except possibly Harold. The silence lasted 8 full seconds. I counted them. Then Derek said, "That's not possible." Martin looked up. "I beg your pardon? That number, that assessment, it's—" Derek stopped. He looked at his attorney, who was looking at the table with an expression I had seen on lawyers' faces before, which was the expression of a man rapidly revising his understanding of the situation he'd been hired to manage. "The assessment was prepared by Kellerman and Associates," Ray Delacroix said, speaking for the first time. "They're a nationally recognized firm. Harold specifically selected them because their methodology is difficult to dispute. The number is accurate, to the best of their analysis, as of 6 months ago. Market conditions since then have, if anything, moved in a favorable direction." Derek's attorney leaned toward his client and said something in a low voice. Derek pulled back slightly, the way a person pulls back from something they've walked toward without realizing it was a wall. "He hid this," Derek said. His voice was different now. The controlled certainty had left it, and what was underneath was rawer, younger, something that sounded almost like grief being rerouted into anger because anger was more manageable. "He built all of this and he hid it. He protected it," I said. Derek looked at me. "From me." I held his gaze. "Yes." Something shifted in the room. Not the atmospheric pressure exactly, but something in that range. The quality of the air, the way people were sitting. Sandra, who had been very still, put her hand on Derek's arm, and he didn't seem to notice. "He left me a company that's hemorrhaging money," Derek said. Not loudly. That was the thing that made it worse. The flatness of it, the exhausted quality. "And he left you?" "Derek," Pauline's voice was quiet but carrying. "Stop. I'm just saying what's true. You're saying it in front of everyone, which is a choice you're making." Derek looked at his sister. Something passed between them. The complicated private language of siblings who have been through too much together and not enough at the right moments. And then Derek looked away, at the window, at the city below it, at the gray November sky. Martin set the documents down. "I want to address the question of any potential legal challenge directly," he said, with the measured tone of a man who has anticipated this moment and prepared for it accordingly. Harold was aware that this disclosure might prompt questions about the legitimacy of the holding company's separation from the primary estate. He included in the sealed file a supporting memorandum from a second independent legal review, conducted by a firm in a different city not affiliated with this office, confirming that the holding company's structure is sound, that the assets were legally and properly held, and that there is no basis for a successful challenge. He looked at Derek's attorney. I can provide copies of all documentation today. I would suggest reviewing it carefully before any further action is considered. Derek's attorney nodded once, without expression. This is what he wanted, Derek said. He wasn't speaking to the room anymore. He was speaking to something in front of him that the rest of us couldn't see. He sat across from me, 100 dinners, 1,000 conversations, and he knew the whole time. I understood looking at him in that moment that this was not simple greed that I was watching fall apart. It was something more complicated, the specific devastation of a person who has spent his life believing he knew the full measure of his father and who is discovering in public in middle age that he did not. That there was an entire dimension of Harold Whitmore that Derek had never been allowed to see, and that the reason for that exclusion was not accidental. That didn't make Derek innocent of what he'd done over 16 years. It didn't make his laugh at the reading forgivable, but it made him human in a way that was harder to look at than contempt would have been. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes, most of it procedural. Martin walking through the documentation, Ray fielding technical questions from Derek's attorney, Pauline's lawyer making notes and asking 2 careful questions about the timeline of the 1994 agreement. I sat and listened and only spoke when someone addressed me directly. At one point, Derek's attorney asked whether there was any possibility of a negotiated restructuring of the estate's assets, a term that meant, in plain language, whether I would consider giving Derek some of what Harold had left me. I looked at the attorney. I looked at Derek, who was not looking at me. No, I said. The attorney nodded. He made another note. As the meeting was wrapping up, as people were gathering their things, and the formal tension was beginning to release into the informal tension of departure, Sandra came around the table. I had not expected that. Sandra had always operated at a careful remove from me, in the way of a person who has made a decision about someone and sees no reason to revisit it. She stood close enough that I could see she had not slept well either, and that her makeup, usually precise, had been applied over the evidence of several difficult weeks. He could lose everything, she said, not confrontationally. Almost quietly, which was not Sandra's register and which told me she was more frightened than she was letting on. The company, if the exposure with Garrett's contracts is as bad as the auditors are saying, Sandra, I kept my voice low. I understand that you're scared, but this is not my problem to solve. Derek made financial decisions. He made them without Harold's knowledge or counsel because he believed he didn't need it, because he was going to inherit everything and correct whatever he wanted to correct from a position of total control. I paused. That didn't happen. And I'm not going to be the person who absorbs the consequences of his certainty. Sandra looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You've really changed." "You said that before," I told her, on the phone. "I mean it differently now." I wasn't sure what she meant by that, and I wasn't sure it mattered. She went back to Derek, who had gotten up from the table and was standing by the door with his attorney, already in the posture of a man composing himself for whatever came next. Pauline found me on my way to the elevator. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I said, which was the honest answer. "Are you?" "Glenn keeps asking me that. I keep saying yes." She pushed the elevator button. "I'm not sure either of us is telling the truth." The elevator came. We rode down together in the specific silence of 2 women who are on the same side of something without being on the same side in any simple way. And when we reached the lobby, we said goodbye in the brief and unsatisfying way of people who need more time than they have. Boop. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 22 minutes before I started the engine. I was not crying. I was not triumphant either, which surprised me. I had thought, somewhere in the anticipation of this moment, that when the truth was finally in the room, when the sealed file was opened and the number was read, and the architecture Harold had built was fully visible, I would feel something larger, something that matched the scale of what he'd prepared. What I actually felt was quieter than that. It was something closer to sorrow than to victory, which was its own kind of surprise. I thought about Derek's face when Martin read the total, the way his certainty had dropped away. Not like a mask coming off, but like a wall coming down. Sudden, structural, irreversible. I had wanted, for a long time, for him to understand what he'd done to me. What he'd done to his father, really, in all those years of positioning and maneuvering and looking at everything Harold built as a resource to be eventually controlled rather than a life to be witnessed. I had wanted him to feel the weight of having been wrong, and he did. I had watched it happen, and it didn't feel the way I'd expected. Maybe that was maturity. Maybe it was grief, still moving through me in ways I couldn't always track. Maybe it was simply that I was 63 years old and I had lived enough to know that watching someone else's reckoning isn't the same as resolution. They were two different things. The reckoning was his. What I did next, that was mine. I started the car. I drove to the farmhouse. I don't know exactly why. It wasn't a plan, but I found myself on rural Route 4 as the afternoon light was going thin and gold, the same light I'd seen through the dirty windows on my first visit, and I pulled up the gravel lane and parked in front of the porch and sat looking at it. The Callaway farmhouse, the thing everyone had laughed at. It needed work. The porch boards, the gutters, the paint. The barn behind it had a door that needed rehinging. The back room where the filing cabinet sat smelled like old paper and needed proper ventilation. It was not a glamorous piece of land seen from the outside. It looked like what it had been pretending to be for 30 years, a forgotten property, off a county road, overgrown and unremarkable. But I knew now what was beneath it. I knew what the map said and what the agreement said and what Harold's careful, patient handwriting had been building toward across 3 decades of holding something that looked like nothing because he needed the world to look elsewhere. I got out of the car and walked up to the porch, carefully, on the solid boards, avoiding the 2 rotted ones. And I stood there in the cold air and looked out at the field, which was dead grass and scrub, and the particular exhausted beauty of late November land. Harold had stood here. He must have. He'd owned this property for 31 years, and he was not a man who owned things without understanding them physically. He had stood on this porch and looked at this field and known what was beneath it and said nothing to anyone. And I tried to imagine what that kind of patience felt like from the inside. Holding something for decades, letting people overlook it, letting them laugh, waiting. I thought I understood it a little better now than I had before the conference room. The sky was going orange at the western edge, the early dark of November coming in from the east. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Ray Delacroix, checking in, probably. Martin, possibly. I didn't answer it. For a little while longer, I wanted to just stand here, in the cold, on Harold's porch, with the field in front of me and the weight of the day settling into something I could almost bear. There was still a great deal left to decide. The farmhouse, the development partnership, the mineral rights. What I was going to do with a number I still couldn't entirely hold in my head. The question of Derek and what became of him. Not my responsibility, but not entirely separable from my life either, because the world is not organized for clean separations, and I had learned that at significant personal cost. But those were tomorrow's questions. Tonight I stood on the porch until the cold drove me back to the car, and then I drove home, and I made dinner, and I sat at the table, and for the first time in 6 weeks, I did not open a legal folder or a legal pad or a letter in Harold's handwriting. I just sat, quietly, in the house that was mine now, and the world outside kept moving, indifferent to the small and enormous fact that everything had changed. The first call from Derek's attorney came 8 days after the conference room meeting, and it was not what I expected. I had been bracing for another challenge, another legal theory, another reframing of the estate structure, another attempt to find a seam in Harold's architecture through which something could be extracted. Ray had warned me it might take several more rounds before Derek's legal team accepted the situation as genuinely unwinnable. I had prepared myself for that, the way you prepare for a sustained cold. You dress for it, you accept it, you don't expect it to be over quickly. But the call from Derek's attorney, a man named Philip Crane, was not adversarial. It was careful, calibrated, and it said, between every line, that something had changed on Derek's side of the board. My client is not at this time pursuing further challenge to the estate structure, Crane said. He's asked me to communicate that to you directly and to your legal representatives. I was standing in the kitchen when he called. I sat down. All right, I said. He's also asked me to communicate. Crane paused, in the way of an attorney choosing words with the precision of a man diffusing something, that he is aware his conduct at the estate reading and in subsequent communications was not appropriate. He has asked me to convey his acknowledgement of that. I sat with that for a moment. He asked you to say that? Yes? Not in his own words. No, not at this time. Another pause. He's dealing with some significant pressures at the company. I think he... Crane stopped, which was interesting because attorneys rarely say more than they mean to. I think he's having a difficult period. I thanked Crane and hung up, and then I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, turning that conversation over. Derek had not called me himself. He had his lawyer deliver an apology-adjacent message with the emotional temperature of a legal notice. That was Derek. Even humbled, still operating through intermediaries, still unable to come directly to the thing he needed to say. Part of me wanted to be angry about that. Part of me recognized it as simply who he was, the specific limitations of a man who had spent 52 years building walls between himself and his own vulnerability and did not know yet how to stop. I was not ready to forgive him, but I noticed that I had stopped waiting for him to confirm what I already knew. That was its own kind of freedom. What was happening to Whitmore Industries was not subtle by December. It was in the business section of the local paper first, a brief item about the company reviewing its investment portfolio. The language of someone trying to make a controlled assessment sound like ordinary prudence. Then a longer piece, 2 weeks later, noting that 2 senior managers had left in the same month. Then a sourced report, unnamed but credible, that Garrett, Derek's longtime COO and the architect of the investment agreements that had gone so badly, had resigned and was being sued personally by the company for breach of fiduciary duty. I read these items not with satisfaction, but with the complicated feeling of watching something you were once connected to come apart. Whitmore Industries had been Harold's creation. 30 years of his intelligence and discipline and calculated risk-taking had built it into something real, and now Derek was inside it, surrounded by the wreckage of decisions Harold would never have made, trying to find a way through that didn't exist. Pauline called me the week the Garrett lawsuit was reported. He called me, she said. Derek, last night. How was he? He cried. She said it simply, without drama, but I could hear what it cost her to say it. I haven't heard him cry since our mother died. He was not okay, Evelyn. I didn't say anything. He told me he'd made a mistake with Garrett's contracts, that he'd known somewhere that it was too aggressive and that he'd done it anyway because he'd wanted to show that he could grow the company faster than Dad had, that he could do it better. Her voice was careful. He said Dad was always the smarter one in the room, and he spent his whole life trying to prove that he wasn't. I closed my eyes. That was the thing about Harold. You could spend decades believing you understood him and then discover that the part you'd missed was the most important part. Derek had spent his whole life competing with a man who was not competing back, and the tragedy of it was that Harold had never wanted a competition. Harold had wanted a son who felt secure enough not to need one. Is he going to lose the company? I asked. The auditors are still... There are still options. A restructuring, possibly. Some asset sales. Pauline's voice was tired in the way of someone who has been on the phone with accountants too often, recently. Glenn has been talking to some people. There might be a buyer for the Eastern Division at a number that would cover most of the Garrett exposure. She paused. It won't look like what he thought it was going to look like. But it won't be nothing. That's something, I said. He doesn't think so. Not yet. She took a breath. Can I ask you something? Yes. Did you know about the company's condition when you were in all those meetings with Martin and Ray? Did you know how much trouble it was in? I knew it had problems, I said. I didn't know the full extent. That wasn't information I had access to. Would it have changed anything for you? I thought about that honestly. No, I said. The two things weren't connected in a way that would have changed my choices. What Harold left me was Harold's decision. What Derek did with the company was Derek's decision. Those are separate. Pauline was quiet for a moment. He's going to have to sell the house in Meridian, the one he and Sandra built 4 years ago, the big one. I did not know what to say to that. The house in Meridian was Derek's monument to himself. 6,000 square feet, a lot in a gated community, the physical proof of a success he'd wanted everyone to see. Losing it would not be the same as losing a home. It would be losing a story he'd been telling about himself for years. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it, in the incomplete way that you mean things when you're sorry for someone's pain, but not for the sequence of events that produced it. Whoopin'. Sandra came to see me in the second week of December. Not Derek. Sandra. She called first, which was different from Derek's unannounced arrival, and she asked if she could come by, and I said yes because I was curious enough about what she wanted to say in person that my curiosity outweighed my wariness. She arrived looking like a woman who had recently had to recalibrate everything she thought she knew about her own life, which was not a comfortable look, but was at least an honest one. The precise makeup was gone. Her hair was pulled back. She was wearing clothes that were still expensive, but not performatively so. And she sat at my kitchen table with both hands around a mug of coffee, like someone who needed the warmth of it. "I owe you an apology," she said. "A real one, not through Philip Crane." I looked at her. "All right. I spent 16 years treating you like you were temporary, like you were a phase Harold was going through, or a mistake he'd made, or—" She stopped, choosing, "or someone who was in a position she didn't deserve. And I'm aware that I made your life in this family harder than it needed to be." I let that sit in the room for a moment. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Derek can't. Not yet. He's—" She pressed her lips together. "He's ashamed, which is new. Derek has been a lot of things in his life, but ashamed hasn't usually been one of them. And he doesn't know how to carry it and keep functioning at the same time, so right now he's just trying to keep functioning." "I understand that," I said. "He's also angry, still, at Harold." She looked up. "Is that terrible to say?" "No," I said. "It's honest. He feels like Harold set him up to fail, like the whole structure, giving him the company and the state it was in, keeping the real assets separate, was designed to," she searched for the word, "humiliate him, publicly. Make him look like the person who couldn't manage what he was given while you got to be the person who—" "That's not what Harold did," I said. "I know that. I think Derek knows it too, underneath. But he's not quite there yet." Sandra looked down at her coffee. "The house is going on the market after the first of the year. Brendan is taking it hard, which is its own thing. He's 24 and he's never had to adjust to anything in his life, and now everything is adjusting at once." She shook her head slightly. "I don't know who that's my fault and who that's just who he is." I thought about Brendan throwing his granola bar wrapper in the direction of the trash can and missing and not picking it up. I thought about how he'd smirked when the lawyer read my inheritance. 24 years old and already so certain of his place in the order of things. "He'll have to figure out who he is without the scaffolding," I said. "That's not the worst thing that can happen to a person at 24. Sandra looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before, which was something close to respect. "You're not what I thought you were," she said. "I know," I said. "I never was." She left 40 minutes later, and I stood at the door and watched her go, and I felt something that I couldn't immediately name. Not warmth, not quite, but something in that direction. The specific feeling of watching a person take a step toward being more honest about who they are. It was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness, but it was something. The legal transfer of the holding company's assets into my name, fully, cleanly, with no outstanding challenges, was completed in the third week of December. Ray called me from his office to confirm it, and his voice had the quiet satisfaction of a man who has spent years building something that has finally held under the weight it was designed to hold. "It's done," he said. "Everything is in order. The development partnership transfer is also finalized. You'll be receiving formal documentation from Meridian Land Partners in the next few days." "Thank you, Ray," I said. "For all of it, the years of it." "Harold did the work," he said. "I just kept the files organized." "That's not true, but I appreciate the modesty." He laughed briefly, the laugh of a man who doesn't do it often enough. What are you going to do now? It was the question I had been sitting with since November, since the farmhouse, since the night I'd written on the legal pad and discovered, with some surprise, that I already knew the answer. I have some ideas, I said. The ideas had started with the legal pad that night, but they had grown considerably since then, fed by conversations I'd been having quietly over the past weeks, with a woman named Dr. Renata Ose, who ran a community development nonprofit in the northern part of the county, with a man named Paul Griswold, who had been Harold's most trusted site manager at the company for 20 years, and who had been quietly worried about his retirement since the company's troubles began, with Martin, who had helped me understand the structural options for philanthropic trusts, and with Ray, who had walked me through what a development partnership stake actually meant in terms of ongoing participation versus one-time returns. What I was building, slowly, imperfectly, with a lot of questions I didn't know the answers to, was not a monument. Harold hadn't built monuments. He'd built things that worked, things that lasted, things that served a purpose specific enough to be real and broad enough to keep being useful. I wanted to do the same with what he'd left me. The farmhouse itself was the beginning. I had already hired a contractor, a woman named Bet, who had been recommended by a neighbor and who had walked through the property with the assessing eye of someone who loves old structures and wants to see them last. And the restoration plan was underway. Not a renovation in the sense of making it modern. A restoration. The wide plank floors, the stone chimney, the bones of it that Harold had kept sound without anyone noticing. Bet said the barn was structurally solid and could be converted to usable space with 6 months of work. What that space would be, I was still deciding, but I was leaning towards something connected to Dr. Ose's work, which focused on agricultural education and economic development in rural communities that had been losing their working-age populations for 20 years. The northern county land, much of which surrounded the Callaway property, had once been actively farmed and was now largely idle. Harold's development corridor would bring infrastructure, which could bring opportunity, if the opportunity was shaped by someone paying attention to what the community actually needed rather than what looked best in a pitch deck. I was not under the illusion that I knew how to do this perfectly. I was 63 years old, and my professional background was in real estate law and office management, and the invisible labor of keeping a complicated man's complicated life organized enough to function. I was not a developer. I was not a nonprofit director. I was not Harold, who had seen things in land and numbers that other people couldn't see. But I was someone who had spent 6 weeks reading every document Harold had ever written about this property, and who had spent 16 years watching what happened when wealth was held without wisdom, and who had, on that cold November porch, stood in the place where Harold had stood and understood, finally, what he had been building toward. He had not been building toward a number. The number was just the tool. He had been building toward a moment when someone he trusted could take what he'd preserved and make it into something that mattered beyond the family, beyond the estate, beyond the conference room table where his son had laughed at his widow for inheriting a farmhouse. I was not going to be perfect at it. I was going to make mistakes and have bad days and need help I didn't know how to ask for. But I was going to try in the specific way that Harold had always tried. Not with noise, not with performance, but with sustained, unglamorous attention to what was real. Derek called me on December 22nd. Not his attorney. Not Sandra. Derek himself on a Tuesday afternoon, and I almost didn't answer for the second time, and then I answered. He was quiet for a moment after I said hello. Long enough that I thought the connection had dropped. "I'm not going to ask you for anything," he said. I needed to say something without a lawyer in the room." "Okay," I said. "I've been wrong about you. For a long time." His voice was rough in the way of someone who has rehearsed a thing and then found, in the moment, that the rehearsal wasn't adequate. "I told myself a story about who you were and what you wanted and why you were with my father, and I held on to that story because it was easier than reconsidering." He stopped. "I was wrong." I sat down on the sofa. "Derek, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't think I've earned that. I just needed you to know that I know." Another pause. "He loved you. He loved you in a way I didn't want to see because seeing it would have meant accepting that I was wrong about you, and I didn't want to be wrong." His voice broke slightly on the last word, not dramatically, just the small fracture of a man who has been holding something too long. He knew I was going to struggle with the company. He knew, and he... Derek didn't finish the sentence. He gave you what you asked for, I said quietly. He gave you the company. He'd been giving you things your whole life, Derek. You just kept expecting the next one to be the one that made you feel like enough. The silence after that was the longest of the call. Yeah, Derek said finally. Just that. I'm not your enemy, I said. I never was. And if you're willing to be honest with yourself about what happened, really honest, not the version you tell the lawyers, then I think you might come through this okay. Not the same, but okay. He made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been something else entirely. The house is going on the market January 3rd. I heard. Brendan's barely speaking to me. Give him time. Sandra says the same thing. A short exhale. She also says you were... He stopped. She said you were decent to her when she came to see you. She didn't expect that. I try to be decent, I said. I don't always manage it, but I try. We talked for another 10 minutes. Not about the estate, not about lawyers, not about the number that had changed everything in that conference room. We talked about Harold, a little carefully, the way you talk about someone when the grief is still recent enough to be dangerous and the conversation has to stay near the edges. Derek mentioned a fishing trip they'd taken when Derek was 12, somewhere in the northern part of the state. And Harold had spent the whole first day reading instead of fishing, and Derek had been furious about it. And then on the second day, Harold had caught more fish than anyone using techniques he apparently knew from a book. Derek almost laughed telling it. Almost. When the call ended, I sat for a while in the quiet of my living room. Outside, the December afternoon was going dark early. The city was lit up for the holidays, all its surfaces reflecting light in the way cities do in winter, beautiful in a way that doesn't require you to be happy to see it. I sat with the phone in my hand and the silence in the house, and the particular weight of a year that had asked more of me than I had known I had to give. I was not done grieving. I would not be done grieving for a long time. Harold's absence was not the kind of thing that resolved. It was the kind of thing that changed shape, that settled into the structure of your days until it was indistinguishable from the ordinary texture of living without someone you had expected to have longer. But I was also sitting in that quiet room on the longest night of a very long year, not without resources, not without purpose, not without the specific grounding weight of knowing what I was doing next and why. Harold had built something and trusted me to carry it forward. I was not going to be worthy of that every day. But I intended to be worthy of it most days, which was, Harold had always said, the best any honest person could promise. The city glittered outside the window. I watched it for a while. Then I got up, turned on the kitchen light, and started making dinner. Spring came late that year, the way it sometimes does in this part of the country. February still gray and grudging, March arriving with one warm week and then pulling back like it had changed its mind, April finally delivering something that felt like a promise kept. By the time the contractor Bet called to tell me the barn conversion was complete, the field behind the Callaway farmhouse had gone from dead winter grass to something tentatively, improbably green. I drove out on a Thursday morning to see it, the same route I had taken that first day after the will reading. Rural Route 4, the bent mailbox, the gravel lane through the overgrown trees. Except the trees were less overgrown now. Bet's crew had cleared the lane in February, and the porch had new boards. And the paint, the same white it had always been because I saw no reason to change what the house had always been, was fresh and clean against the April sky. I stood in the barn doorway for a long time. Bet had done something I hadn't fully anticipated, which was understand what I wanted before I'd been able to say it clearly. The interior was open, timber-framed, with the original structure preserved where it was sound and replaced exactly where it needed to be. Good light through north-facing windows. Enough space for 30 people to work together without crowding. Concrete floors, polished. A small kitchen along the south wall. Simple, durable, functional. It looks like a place where people can actually work, I said. Bet, standing beside me with her hands in her jacket pockets, nodded once. That was the idea. It was going to be the first program space for the Whitmore Callaway Rural Initiative, a name I had argued about with Dr. Renata Osei for 3 weeks before we landed on something we could both live with. Renata had wanted to call it something that emphasized the community rather than any individual. I had agreed with her instinct, but wanted Harold's name attached to it, not for vanity, but because Harold had protected this land for 30 years specifically, so it could become something, and I felt he deserved to have his name on the thing it became. We settled on a compromise that put the land's own history first and Harold's second, which felt right. Renata came out that afternoon to see the completed barn, and she walked through it the way she walked through everything, thoroughly, practically, with her phone out taking measurements and photographs and asking questions that revealed exactly how carefully she had thought about the program logistics. "The kitchen will work," she said. "For the food preservation workshops, this is enough space. If we add a second cohort in the fall, we'll need another structure eventually. But this gets us started." She turned around in the center of the open space, looking at the light. "Harold would have liked this." "You never met him," I said. "No, but I've read everything you gave me about how he worked. And this," she gestured, "not just at the barn, but at the property generally. This is the work of someone who thought in decades, who understood that you plant things knowing you won't see them full grown." She looked at me. "That's rare. Most people want to see the result before they commit to the effort." I thought about Harold reading in the fishing boat while Derek fumed on the dock. Harold knowing what was beneath the Callaway field and saying nothing for 17 years. Harold writing a letter to be opened only after 45 days because he knew the timing mattered as much as the content. "Yes," I said, "it was rare." The Whitmore Industries situation resolved itself, not cleanly but adequately, in the way that most things resolve when the people involved are finally forced to be honest about the actual numbers. The Eastern Division sale had gone through in February. A buyer had materialized. The price had been lower than Derek had wanted, but higher than the auditors had feared, and the proceeds had covered the Garrett exposure with enough left over to stabilize the remaining operations. Whitmore Industries still existed. It was smaller. It had new management in 3 key positions because Derek had finally accepted, after a very difficult series of conversations with the board, that running the company required people around him who would tell him the truth, rather than people who needed him to keep believing he was right. That had been the hardest admission of all, from what Pauline told me. Harder than the house sale, harder than the public restructuring, harder than any of the financial reckoning. The admission that he had surrounded himself with agreement because agreement felt like loyalty, and that loyalty of that kind was the most expensive thing he'd ever bought. Brendan had moved into a rental apartment with 2 roommates and gotten a job at a mid-sized marketing firm, the kind of job he would have found beneath him a year ago, and which was, by every account Pauline relayed, doing him considerable good. He had called me once, in March, which I had not expected. He hadn't said much. He'd said he was sorry for the way he'd acted at the reading. He'd said it in the awkward, slightly wooden way of a 24-year-old who hasn't had much practice apologizing for anything significant, and I'd told him I appreciated it and that I hoped he was doing okay. And that had been that. Small, incomplete, but real, which mattered more than complete. Derek and Sandra had moved into a house in a different part of the city. Not the gated community, not the monument, but a house that was genuinely a home. 4 bedrooms, a yard, the kind of address that said "we live here" rather than "we have arrived." Sandra had told me this in one of the occasional texts we'd begun exchanging. Not frequent, not warm exactly, but honest, which was something neither of us had managed for 16 years. Pauline came to the farmhouse in May. It was a Saturday, and the initiative's first agricultural education workshop was happening in the barn. 12 participants from 3 different communities in the northern county learning soil amendment techniques from a pair of extension agents Dr. Osei had recruited. I had been moving between the barn and the farmhouse all morning, making sure things were working, handling the small logistical fires that always erupt on first days regardless of how carefully you've prepared. Pauline arrived at noon and found me in the farmhouse kitchen making coffee for 20 people, which was producing an unglamorous amount of chaos. And she put down her bag and said, "Tell me where things are," and help me for an hour without making it into anything larger than it was. That was something I had always respected about Pauline. She was capable of showing up and being useful without requiring the moment to be acknowledged. When the workshop broke for lunch and the participants spilled out into the yard, Pauline and I sat on the porch with our own coffee and looked at the field, which was properly green now, and the barn, from which the sound of conversation and occasional laughter was drifting out through the open doors. "Dad would have loved this week," she said, the same thing Renata had said. I was beginning to think it was simply true. "I hope so," I said. "I keep second-guessing the details, whether the program structure is right, whether I've set it up so it can actually survive without me hovering over it." "That's how you know you're doing it right," Pauline said, "when you care enough about it to worry whether it'll outlast you." I looked at her. "When did you get philosophical?" "Glenn says it's middle age." She almost smiled. "He's not wrong." We sat for a while. In the yard, two of the workshop participants were examining something in the grass near the fence line, something growing, some volunteer plant they'd found interesting. They were crouching over it the way people crouch over things when they're genuinely curious, not performing curiosity, but actually feeling it. I watched them and felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for a long time. "Evelyn," Pauline said. "Yes. For what it's worth, and I know it doesn't fix anything, I'm sorry I didn't do more. When he was difficult with you, over the years, I was aware of it. I told myself it wasn't my place, that it was between the two of you, that getting in the middle of it would make things worse." She looked at her coffee. "I told myself a lot of things." "Pauline, let me say it. I've been trying to say it since November, and I keep not getting there." She took a breath. "You were in that family for 16 years, and I watched my brother make it harder than it needed to be, and I made myself small about it, and that wasn't right. You deserved better, and Dad deserved to see his wife treated better, and I knew that, and I chose the easy thing." She looked up. "I'm sorry. I sat with that. The real thing about apologies is that you can't rush your response to them without making them about you, instead of about the person offering them. And Pauline had just offered me something genuine that had cost her something." "I know you were in a hard position," I said. "You were his sister before you were anyone else. I never expected you to choose sides. Still, I agreed." "Thank you." She nodded. She looked back at the yard. The two workshop participants had stood back up and were taking photographs of the plant with their phones. "Dad chose well," Pauline said. "When he chose you." I didn't answer that. I didn't need to. The summer moved the way summers do when you're doing work that matters. Fast in the moments that are full, and slow in the moments when you stop long enough to notice where you are. The initiative's first cohort completed their program in August. 4 of the 12 participants had identified parcels of land in the northern county, idle land, some of it adjacent to the development corridor, that they wanted to bring back into productive use. 2 of them had already filed for the county's agricultural revitalization grant, which Dr. Osei had helped me navigate getting the initiative designated to support. The development partnership with Meridian Land Partners was, by summer, producing its first concrete results. Not money yet exactly, but movement. Site preparation along the corridor. Infrastructure discussions with the county that were serious rather than theoretical. Ray attended the partnership meetings with me and explained the pieces I didn't understand and did not make me feel foolish for not understanding them, which was more than I could say for some people I'd worked with in my legal career. At one of those meetings, in July, one of the Meridian partners, a man named Charles Okafor, who had been Harold's contact at the company for years, said something that has stayed with me. We were reviewing the corridor timeline, and someone had made a reference to Harold's original 1994 agreement, and Charles had said, almost to himself, he never wavered. In 30 years, every time there was a reason to revisit the arrangement, to take a different deal or a faster return, Harold said no. He said the value was in waiting for the right moment. Charles had looked at me. I understand that better now, meeting you. I hadn't known what to say to that. I still don't exactly, but I think about it. In September, I went back to the farmhouse alone for the first time since the spring busy season had begun. The barn was dark and quiet. No workshop, no participants, just the smell of clean wood and the sound of the field outside. The farmhouse itself had been properly restored by then, the floors refinished, the kitchen functional, the back room where the filing cabinet had sat turned into a small office. The filing cabinet itself was still there. I hadn't moved it. I thought probably it should stay. I sat in the office with the door open to the back of the house and the late September light coming in, and I opened the cabinet's upper drawer, which was empty now. All the documents transferred to Martin's office, properly recorded, the legal work complete. I sat with the empty drawer for a moment. I had been thinking recently about what Harold had felt in that last year of his life, knowing what was coming, having arranged everything he could arrange, waiting. I had been thinking about whether he'd been at peace with it or whether peace was too easy a word for what you feel when you've done everything you can and you still have to let go of the outcome. I had a feeling it was somewhere in between. Harold was not a man who found peace easily. He was a man who found clarity, which was related but not the same thing. What I had learned in the year since his death was that the two things I had thought were opposites, loving someone and protecting yourself, were not opposites at all. Harold had loved his children, genuinely, with the flawed and complicated love of a man who had his own damage and limitations. And he had also, with clear eyes, structured his final gift to protect me from the way that love could be weaponized by people who had confused it with entitlement. He had done both things at once. Not because he didn't trust his children to be better, I think he hoped they would be, but because he knew that hope was not a plan. That was the lesson I had spent a year learning to hold without bitterness. That you can love people and still protect yourself from them. That protecting yourself is not an act of hostility. It is an act of dignity. That no one, not a widow, not an elderly parent, not any person at any age, is required to make themselves smaller so that someone else can feel larger. Harold had known this. He had known it and built it into the structure of the last thing he ever gave me. Derek came to the farmhouse in October. He called first, 2 days in advance, formal enough that I understood he was not sure of his welcome and was trying to give me the option. I told him to come on Saturday afternoon, and when Saturday came, I made coffee and waited. And at 2 o'clock his car came up the gravel lane, slower than he would have driven it a year ago, with a kind of tentativeness in the approach that I had never seen from him before. He stood on the porch and looked at the farmhouse. The fresh paint, the new boards, the barn visible behind it with the doors open, and I watched his face go through something that I don't have a clean word for. It was not envy, or not only that, it was recognition. The look of someone who is seeing, for the first time, what a thing actually was, now that all his previous assumptions about it have been cleared away. He built this, Derek said. Not a question. He preserved it, I said. I'm building it. Derek nodded. We went inside and sat at the kitchen table. Not Harold's table at the city house, just a farmhouse table I'd found at an estate sale, solid pine, 4 chairs, and I poured coffee and we sat with it. How is the company? I asked. Better, he said. Not good, but better. The new operations director she knows what she's doing, more than I gave her credit for initially. He turned the coffee mug in his hands. She told me in her first month that the company's culture had a problem with accountability and that it started at the top. I almost fired her. But you didn't. No. A short pause. I didn't. That was something. That was actually a great deal. We talked for an hour and a half. Not easily. There were silences. And the silences had the particular weight of 16 years of things unsaid, which don't disappear just because circumstances have changed. But we talked honestly, which was new, and when honesty is new between two people who have known each other a long time, it has a rawness to it that is uncomfortable. And also, underneath the discomfort, something that feels like the ground being solid under your feet. He asked about the initiative. I told him about the first cohort, about the land revitalization grants, about what Renata was building toward for the second year of the program. He listened in a way he hadn't used to listen, without the overlay of judgment, without the parallel processing of how this information related to his own position. He just listened. At one point he said, he knew what this was going to be when he bought it, didn't he? He saw something, I said. I don't think he knew exactly, but he saw what it could be, and he kept it intact until the moment was right. Derek was quiet. Then, he did that with people too. Saw what they could be. He looked at the table. I don't think I understood that until this year. I thought he was withholding, keeping things from me as a form of control. He stopped. He wasn't. He was just waiting for me to be ready for things, and I kept telling him I was ready when I wasn't. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to add to that. Before he left, Derek stood on the porch again and looked at the field. The afternoon was golden and cooling, October doing what October does. I'm sorry, Evelyn. His voice was plain. No lawyers, no intermediaries, no careful language. For the laugh, for the years of it, for treating you like you were in the way. He looked at me directly for the first time in the conversation. He loved you, you made him happy, and I spent 16 years resenting you for both of those things, which says everything about me and nothing about you. I looked back at him, 52 years old, thinner than he'd been a year ago, wearing a jacket that was good but not expensive, standing on the porch of the thing he had laughed at. I accept that, I said. And I'm sorry too. For the times I let my anger at you make me harder than I needed to be. For not trying harder to reach you when things might still have been reachable. He nodded. It wasn't reconciliation, not the movie version, where people embrace and music swells and the years of damage are retroactively healed. It was two imperfect people standing on a porch in October, acknowledging the truth of what had happened and choosing not to carry the full weight of it into whatever came next. That is the real version. That is what it actually looks like. He drove back down the gravel lane, and I stood on the porch until the sound of his car faded, and then I sat down in the chair I'd put there in the spring, a plain wooden chair, solid, nothing special, and I looked at the field and the barn and the trees at the edge of the property and the sky above all of it, going orange at the edges the way it does in October, late afternoon, when the light is doing everything it can with what little time it has left. There is something I have thought about often in the year since Harold died, that I want to say plainly because I think it is the most important thing I've learned, and I don't want to lose it in the telling of everything else. I was 63 years old when I became a widow. I was the person who, in a room full of people who thought they knew the score, received an inheritance that everyone laughed at. I was the person a 52-year-old man had decided, before I'd even opened my mouth, was worth nothing more than a dismissive gesture. And I want you to understand, whoever you are, wherever you're watching this, whatever your age and whatever your circumstance, that the laugh in that conference room was not really about me. It never was. It was about Derek's certainty. It was about what happens when someone has lived so long inside their own assumptions that they've stopped being able to see anything outside them. The laugh was not a weapon aimed at me. It was a window into a person who had never genuinely reckoned with the fact that he could be wrong. What Harold gave me was not just land and agreements and mineral rights and development stakes. He gave me evidence. He gave me the physical, documented, legally airtight proof that he had seen me clearly, not as a convenience, not as a presence to be managed, not as a phase or a mistake or a temporary arrangement, but as the person he trusted most in the world with the thing he'd spent his life building toward. That is worth more than any number on any valuation document. And what I want to say to anyone who has ever been laughed at, dismissed, treated as though their worth was obvious and obviously small, is this. The people who do that are not seeing you. They are seeing their own assumptions projected onto you and calling it the truth. Your job is not to convince them otherwise. Your job is to know what you are and to keep that knowledge somewhere they cannot reach it and to build from it regardless. Harold held something quiet for 30 years. No one knew. No one saw. Everyone who might have looked at the surface and concluded there was nothing worth looking further for. And beneath the surface, Harold was building something real. You are allowed to do the same. You're allowed to be the person no one has correctly evaluated yet. You're allowed to hold something carefully, protect it from people who would diminish it, and wait for the moment when it can become what you always knew it could be. You are allowed to outlast the laugh. I am 64 years old. I'm a widow. I run a small rural development initiative out of a farmhouse on rural Route 4 that everyone thought was worthless. I have a complicated relationship with 2 stepchildren that is neither repaired nor beyond repair. I have a barn full of people learning things that will help them build something lasting, and a field that is green in spring for the first time in decades, and a stone chimney that Harold kept sound without anyone noticing, and a filing cabinet in the back room that is empty now because everything it held has been put to use. I have more than I can spend and less than I need and exactly enough to work with, which Harold always said was the only position worth being in. He was right. He was usually right. I did not always tell him so when it would have mattered, and that is something I have made my peace with, imperfectly, the way you make peace with anything you can't go back and change. But I'm telling him now, in the only way left available, by doing the work, by keeping this land, by honoring the vision that he held quietly for 3 decades and trusted me to carry forward. That is the whole of the story. That is what Harold Whitmore left behind, and what Evelyn Carter Whitmore is still, every ordinary day, trying to be worthy of. It is not a fairy tale. It is not clean. It is not finished. But it is real, and it is mine, and no one is laughing anymore.